want to welcome you all to our very first in a series of webinars or meetings. I am Connie Kasri. I'm at the UCLA, and I'm representing our Autism Research Consortium on Communication. This is a consortium that's funded by HRSA, and our goal is to connect researchers, community partners nationwide to generate innovative evidence-based approaches to communication and language opportunities for autistic individuals. Let's see. Uh, okay. So our partners include these academic sites on the left. So Drexel, North Carolina, UC Davis, of course, UCLA, Kansas, Minnesota State, and University of Rochester. And at each of these community or academic sites, we have community partners. These are, local agencies and groups that partner with us around our shared goals in research and dissemination. And on the right are our community partners here in Los Angeles. So I want to make sure that everyone knows about some of our upcoming ARC events. And these are really coordinated by Wendy Shee, our statistician here at UCLA. In June, end of June, June 27th, we have a conference at Drexel that's being organized by our Drexel partners, Voices That Matter, centering AAC use for research, practice, and policy. And then in August 17th, we have another Zoom meeting, which will be a Q&A with Dr. Danny Almarell on smart designs. And we already have a video series on the website that you can view beforehand and then come and just ask him questions about this methodology. Our goal is to have at least one or two methodological webinars each year for the next 3 years. And then in the fall, we'll also have webinars on content. So we have one on assessments for non-speaking minimally verbal children, and we'll have a panel discussion with Lynn Abaduto, Nancy Brady, and Brian Boyd, all of whom have developed assessments for assessing language in minimally verbal individuals. So stay tuned for all those and join us. A bit of housekeeping, so please mute your microphone, post your questions in the Q&A, and you can turn off your camera because our speaker will have slides. So today's webinar is with our speaker is Carly Hyde Tillis. She's a PhD candidate in health policy and management at UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. Her research focuses on implementation science, health services research, and autism and other neurodevelopmental disabilities. And she has particular interests in caregiver engagement, service delivery, and intervention implementation. She's really become expert at using qualitative mixed methods and implementation science approaches to understand how families access, navigate, sustain developmental and behavioral interventions in real-world settings. And I'm very excited about this because I think a lot of us have a lot of qualitative information when we do a study, especially a clinical trial. And Carly has figured out how to use AI in this framework to help us understand more of the qualitative implications of our research. So today she's going to share lessons learned from using AI-supported framework analysis to examine that implementation process within a remote caregiver-mediated intervention trial. So I will turn it over to Carly, and we'll have time for questions at the end. So thank you, Carly. Let's see, I need to stop sharing, don't I? Yes, I do. Okay.
And I'll go ahead and share my screen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Everybody able to see that all right? Okay. Um, Thank you to Dr. Kazri for the invitation to present this work today. I'm really excited about these methods. It's something I've been working on quite a bit for the last couple of years, and also a method that hasn't been published yet. So this is something that's evolving, and I'm very open and eager to hear any insight or thoughts or questions or you know, anything that you think might be helpful to improving the rigor of these methods. So look forward to the discussion at the end. Jumping right in, today's talk is designed as a methods webinar, so you should walk away understanding how AI can support implementation analysis using frameworks. I'll be showing a workflow for analyzing large clinical trial data sets, and we'll also discuss some of the opportunities and limitations of AI-supported implementation methods. And we'll consider the implications for future clinical trial research. The methods that I'll be presenting today could really be applied to any clinical trial, but I'll be grounding the presentation in this one particular clinical trial directed by Dr. Kazri, which you can think of as a case study for these methods. So this study focused on children with tuberous sclerosis complex, or TSC, which is a rare condition affecting 1 in 6,000 births. Children are often diagnosed early in life, and they experience a range of complex developmental disabilities, including things like autism, epilepsy, and many other medical and developmental challenges. And so this study was the first fully remote randomized control trial for this behavioral intervention, Jasper, which was delivered by telehealth to participants over the course of 12 weeks. And it was delivered as a parent-mediated intervention. And data that I'll talk about in this study includes 22 participants from the treatment group. Providing care for children with TSC can be very complex for a number of reasons, and particularly given the sometimes extensive parenting responsibilities and stressors that come from things like medical appointments, seizures and changing health, variable response to medication, which can also impact the child's attention and regulation, which can impact their participation in Jasper. Um, and it can also, it just compounds on all of the other caregiving and family demands. So that makes participating in in a parent-mediated behavioral intervention like this one challenging in a number of ways. And when we think about clinical trials, we always report primary outcomes like efficacy and the statistical results, the overall outcome of the trial. I'll use yet another iceberg metaphor here to describe that there's also a lot of other data that exists within clinical trials that's really rich, but is sometimes hard to analyze. And so that can include documentation like coaching notes, weekly forms, session observations, communication with families, and other documents that contextualize the factors and engagement patterns that come up for families. Um, but like we mentioned, it can be challenging to analyze all of this data. But we might hope to answer questions about implementation, like why do some families disengage? How do families adapt the intervention? What are the facilitators and barriers to participating? How do their experiences in the intervention change over the course of their time enrolled? And what can we learn to improve delivery for future families? And so these are the types of questions that we were hoping to answer within this clinical trial. Implementation science or implementation research offers a method called framework analysis, which is used to support organizing and interpreting large and usually qualitative data sets. So this method has been used across health services research and implementation research, and it's really, really well regarded and it's very useful. But framework analysis can also be really time intensive and can require a lot of data processing that's often done within large teams of researchers. And so we were interested in understanding whether AI could support the key steps in establishing in this established analytic process while still maintaining rigor and researcher oversight. So I'm going to walk through each of the steps of framework analysis and share with you how we used this existing method, how we added AI to it, and how we use it for this particular study. So the first step in framework analysis is identifying an appropriate framework. And so frameworks provide a structured way to understand and explain complex conditions and situations by organizing information into meaningful categories and relationships. And so there are dozens, if not hundreds, of frameworks that one might use for something like um, framework analysis. We selected CFIR as the most applicable framework because it provides a structured approach for identifying barriers, facilitators, and implementation processes. But really, you could select any framework that is applicable to the specific research questions and the data that you have available to you. So we took this existing CFIR framework and adapted it for the specific needs of our study. So we knew as we approached these research questions that seizures are disruptive for families, and we have research showing that seizure severity predicts attrition in clinical trials. So we really wanted to focus on that aspect of the clinical trial. And we were also interested in the telehealth aspect of the study since that was fairly novel in this context. So we created constructs within the framework for those unique and important aspects of our study. So in the end, we ended up with 20 constructs in the domain, in across several different domains. So that included things like intervention characteristics, process, outer setting, and inner setting, and individual characteristics. So within those five domains, we have a total of 20 constructs that characterize all the different important components of the implementation of the behavioral intervention. So once the framework is identified, we then move into the second step, which is indexing or labeling. Those are terms that are both used fairly interchangeably to describe this process. But I'm going to call it labeling for this presentation. And so labeling is the process of applying the framework to the data and sorting the data into the different constructs. And so this is where we really start to integrate AI into this workflow. So taking a step back, just I know that there might be a range of familiarity with AI tools in the audience here, so I wanted to kind of orient you to what type of tool this is. So I chose to use OpenAI as the tool that I worked with for a couple of reasons. One, it has some really strong capabilities that allowed for this type of work and for this type of rigor that I was interested in. And two, it's one of the two platforms approved by our institution for use with de-identified research data. So that meant that this was accepted by the institution as a platform we could use. And then we also submitted the specific usage of this data and this platform to the IRB, which was also approved. So as opposed to a chat bot or like just using a chat directly within an AI tool, I prefer to work with GPT agents, which are available within the OpenAI platform. And there are a few features of these agents that I think are really important. So one is you're able to code specifically transparent and persistent instructions. So those would be things like defining the function of the agent, creating rules around data processing, and really specifying what I want the output structure to look like. And then I could also edit those rules and make changes to the GPT so that I knew exactly what I was changing and what instructions the GPT was following. So this added a lot of transparency to the process. The next feature of the GPT agent is that I was able to embed the code book directly into the knowledge center of the tool. So this code book included all of my definitions and decision rules, and I could update those on my own documents whenever I wanted, and then just upload the updated version into the knowledge center and know that the GPT was using the most up-to-date code book. And then the third feature here is that I was able to define within the instructions of the GPT the specific output that I wanted it to use. So this ended up saving a ton of time because it meant that I could directly copy and paste the data that the GPT was outputting directly into my spreadsheet. I could specify the exact columns that I wanted, the exact format that I wanted it in, and this really saved a ton of time in the workflow. Okay, so now going into this process of data labeling and how I used the GPT to support that. So there were two phases to this process, and the first phase is developing and stabilizing that GPT agent. So I've found now over doing this project, this type of method in a few different projects, that it takes about 30% of the data to develop a stable GPT agent that does what you want it to do consistently, without errors. And that doesn't mean that you're throwing away that 30% of the data. You still get to use it, but you're training the GPT agent on approximately 30% of the data. And so that process included inputting data into the GPT. The GPT would then label the data according to my constructs, and then I would review every single line of output from the GPT and make notes, make edits, edit the code book, edit the instructions for the GPT, and cycle through that process to build something consistent. And then in that development process, I would also test the data and bring in different types of data and different types of participants to really develop something that worked across the all of the needs of the study. And so this iteration kept going until it was stable. This took me approximately 50 iterations to get something that worked consistently. And to do that, to identify when that was stable, I typically use the rule of thumb, which is similar to qualitative research, the idea of saturation, where you're trying to ensure that across three participants, you're not having any major issues. Once I was able to do that, then I moved into phase two. So phase two for the study just included reanalyzing using this now stable GPT agent all of the data for the study. So that's the remaining 70% of data that I haven't touched, and also reprocessing that first 30% of data. And throughout all of phase two, doing continuous verification and monitoring of the output, and then also some automated reviews for different types of completeness and errors that I'll also talk about a little bit later. This is an example of the code book, just so you can get an idea of what information I was providing to the GPT in order to appropriately apply those constructs to the data. So I included things like definitions, which originated from the original CFIR definitions, and then I adapted them as needed throughout the development of the GPT. I provided decision rules for each construct, examples of what it might look like, and then some additional notes to kind of reference where a code might go somewhere else. So there's a lot of information that you can provide and edit and continue to fine tune to ensure that the assignment of constructs is aligned with how you as the researcher are conceptualizing it. Okay, so digging a little bit more into the types of data that I was labeling, I'll start with qualitative data, which is a little bit more familiar to folks. If you've done any type of qualitative data analysis, then the idea of coding or labeling your data will be pretty familiar. In standard framework analysis, this process is done by hand. So we used AI to speed up that process. So how this worked is I would input segments of qualitative data. These came from things like coaching notes, which were recorded weekly, and also from open-ended survey questions and written responses from the families. So I find that inputting data at about a paragraph size at a time is the most effective. If you input a lot more than that, then you might not get as thorough of answers. If you input a lot less than that, it takes much longer to do. So I found this to be the appropriate size for inputting text into the GPT. So I input that text, and the GPT agent will segment it into meaningful units. It'll apply the most appropriate construct from the code book, and it will generate the structured output that I'm requesting from it. So this is what that output would look like. And I also used quantitative data in this GPT agent. And this is where the power of AI really becomes the most visible because qualitative data coding is typically done by hand, and that's something that's familiar to folks. But framework analysis doesn't typically integrate quantitative data, largely because doing so would be incredibly painstaking. So in this particular study, I pulled quantitative data from 5 different forms, each of which were administered up to 14 times, with as many as 30 questions per form. So that alone resulted in thousands of data items. So going through those data items by hand would be a substantial undertaking. But with the GPT agent, what we were able to do was upload the forms one at a time, so one form for one participant, upload that into the GPT, and then the GPT would review all time points for that one form, for that one participant, and start to summarize observed patterns using actual data. And then the tool is able to assign the CFIR construct to the data output, and then output everything in the appropriate format. And so, in a matter of seconds, we were really able to see, for example, that this particular caregiver consistently reported that the intervention was not complex in their view, but that it was consistently challenging for them to find the time to use the strategies. And we also could see that their confidence started out as pretty moderate, but grew steadily over the course of the intervention. And so this was a really powerful way to integrate the huge amount of quantitative data from multiple different types of sources into this framework analysis process. Okay, so thinking back to the GPT agent and how that's formatted, if you recall, there's the GPT instructions section where you can tell the GPT exactly how you want it to perform. And so there were a few key instructions that I found were really important to the quality of the data processing. And so the first one was comprehensive. I iterated numerous times to the GPT across the instructions that I wanted every interpretable unit of meaning coded. And for this project, I defined that to the GPT that a meaningful unit was defined as the smallest segment of data that conveyed a distinct implementation relevant idea. So that could be something like a single sentence, a part of a sentence, a survey trend across time points, or a brief contextual statement about the family's circumstances. And I also gave the GPT clear examples of what that looked like, what it didn't look like, and clear examples to train it to do that segmenting accurately. And then again, tested it and reiterated until I was confident that it was doing that accurately and consistently. Another component here was ensuring that context and background was retained as data. So that meant that anytime if in passing within the qualitative text it mentioned that the caregiver was employed full time, even if they were talking about something else, like how busy they were, I ensured that the GPT retained all of that contextual information that might be kind of slipped in or embedded throughout the data. Um, Another key component of this was the constraint that I required from the GPT. So that included instructions specifying that it was prohibited from fabricating or modifying quotes, and that it was prohibited from any causal interpretation. So I didn't want it linking 2 points together to assume something. I wanted it entirely data-driven with no additional interpretation. And then I also found, many of you might have noticed this as well, that that ChatGPT loves to add positive and causal spin to data. So another rule to require that all of the data remained neutral in language, and that it was only using descriptive language. So again, these kind of chipped away at some of the major issues that might come up with using AI to process data. And then finally, the temporal trends were something that I was really interested in. So that included identifying trends and stability and fluctuations using all available data points, but not interpreting beyond the observed scores. So, even 1 point fluctuations could be meaningful. So really keeping that data processing grounded in the real data. Okay, and then I mentioned the human oversight that was persistent throughout, and I'm going to go a little bit more into what that actually means. So, in phase one, which was again that GPT development phase, that's where, there was really detailed researcher oversight for every single output. I would review that output against the source data, and through that process, identify missing content, misinterpretation, construct misalignment, really any issues that I could see using my own review against the real source data to guide that process. And that also included a lot of documentation of edge cases and decision logic in the code book. So if there were times where something could be coded as one of two constructs, really making clear decisions about how I wanted that coded. Um, and then again, iterating until it was stable, which was that, I could put multiple participants through the pipeline without major issues. And then phase two is where the human oversight and the researcher monitoring, becomes even more important. Um, so the first aspect of researcher monitoring, so as the GPT is outputting data, is to review the outputs for technical drift. So these might be things like if it starts using causal language, if it starts missing context from data, if there are inconsistencies in the way the output is being given. So like the columns might be misformatted or something. And I found that oftentimes the GPT agent, after 20 or 30 chats with the GPT agent, it might need a reminder to follow all of the rules. Kind of like a babysitter almost. You need to say, no, remember, you're supposed to be following this rule about causal language. Um, I also found that if the chat got too big, then sometimes it just needed to be refreshed in order for it to set back to the original rule set. I can also tell you from doing this that pure hallucination is pretty rare, so that's not necessarily what you're looking at, but really ensuring that the GPT is continuing to follow your rules. But then the more challenging component of this human review is identifying accurate representation of the data. So that requires a high degree of data familiarity, and you'll hear me repeat that throughout the presentation today because I think that's potentially the most important aspect of this pipeline. So while things like pure hallucinations are rare, um, this type of error where you are reading data that sounds plausible can be really insidious and it can be challenging to catch it. So again, that's why familiarity is probably the most important thing of the aspect of this entire project. So I was the coordinator for this clinical trial, so I knew the details of every participant, and I'd also worked extensively with the data. So as I was reading the output, I was doing constant comparison against my own knowledge to ensure that there was accurate representation of the data. So when something looked out of place, or if it was interesting, or I hadn't seen it before, or considered it before, or maybe it was something I didn't remember from the case, or maybe something I did remember from the case wasn't there, I would dig into it more against the source data to verify the GPT's interpretation. And then I could always override or add to the GPT output. And these types of observations throughout are also helpful to track, particularly things like how often are you overriding the AI output? What kind of output are you frequently overriding? And that might lead to some more fine tuning of the GPT. Maybe you want to go back to the instructions and edit them more if you're noticing like major errors that keep coming back up. Or they actually also might be observations that lead to key insights and later become themes. So things you want to keep track of. Okay, and there are a few ways to quantify these monitoring efforts to really evaluate the AI performance. So, for example, we calculated inter-rater reliability between the AI tool and the researcher. So that's a metric of agreement between those two on construct assignment. So that's something you can track. So how often are you changing the construct that it's assigned? And then we also ran automated verification checks. So that's where I would run the original data back against the process data and have the GPT double check its work and produce clear numerical metrics for how complete it was. So, did it capture all of the relevant content? And then, what was the percent of faithfulness? So, were there any fabrications or quote modifications? And again, complete hallucinations, very, very rare. What was more common would be like a wording change or something pretty minor that I didn't find to be too concerning. And I'll also say that there's not yet a consensus on what's appropriate to report. And this is very much an emerging and evolving field, but we can pull some ideas from machine learning and from LLM spaces, and general qualitative methods and some of the rigorous methods that they use. So those are where some of these different types of metrics come from. So after data labeling, we had approximately 6,200 construct labeled observations across all of these data sources. So step three is charting, which is where you sort those individual data items into a more synthesized framework matrix. So again, we used AI for this. So that included sorting that spreadsheet by participant and by construct, and then going through one at a time, one participant, one construct for one participant, and uploading, kind of copy and pasting that back into the GPT to have it give a summary. And so through this process, it requires a lot of engagement with the data. So you're not just taking the first summary that it's given, but you're really engaging with it as a researcher. So are all of the relevant evidence IDs represented? Is there any causal language that's being inserted? Is there any information beyond the source data? And are all of the interpretations faithful to the evidence? And then also, as you're going through this, again, starting to memo any interesting insights or themes that come up. So I repeated this for every single cell to create a big matrix with all of the participants in rows and all of the CFIR constructs in columns. Okay, and again at this stage, just to kind of emphasize a few of the additional trustworthiness strategies that I embedded in this. At this stage, we're kind of moving from just simply data coding more into data synthesis. So there are a few additional elements that I'd like to highlight, and these all come from qualitative research methods. So one is that analytic memoing, so really documenting in a separate research journal as any patterns are emerging or any interesting findings or insights are emerging. And these memos really become the bridge from your raw data from your matrix into the themes, so into that synthesis and analysis that you're doing. And again, I'll highlight the familiarity with the data and how critically important that was, and how it played into the ongoing review of AI outputs. And then another really important element of this is the data traceability. So for every single item of data, um, each item had an evidence ID that was maintained throughout. And so as I start to summarize these kind of data segments, every single sentence is linked back to raw data, to multiple data items available. And that allows me to see kind of how substantiated each aspect of the summaries are. And it also allows me to trace back to the original source data if I want to verify anything myself. Okay, so the last step of the framework analysis method is mapping and interpretation. So this is really the synthesis step of framework analysis, and that's where we really start to analyze the data and produce the final results. So again, at this stage, we have a matrix with all of our participants and all of our constructs. And so we can start to analyze this in a couple of different ways. We can start to summarize um, column by column to get these construct level summaries. We can start to summarize row by row to get participant level summaries. Um, and so you can copy and paste each of these rows into either a GPT, or sometimes you might use a chat with a prompt, but really trying to use something to um, engage with the data. So again, with each of these summaries, you're receiving the evidence IDs and you're asking questions to ensure that the data is completely represented, that you're understanding all the details and nuances, and anything that's important to you as the researcher, and then referring back to the source data when needed. So from there, you'll have a set of construct summaries, so summaries of every single construct. You'll have participant summaries for every single participant, and then you'll have all of your memos and observations and insights that you generated along the way. And so this step is where you can really take all of your data and start to synthesize them into themes. And this is probably my favorite part of the process and where, there's just some really fun ways to engage with AI, because this is where you can really deeply get into the data synthesis and AI becomes a chat partner that has access to all of the data. So that allows you to quickly synthesize different ideas. If you have something you want to check in the data, you can quickly answer those questions using real data. It allows you to identify patterns that might be time consuming to identify by hand. You can start to look for contradictory evidence, and that's a really important component of this is um, really challenging all of the statements from AI. Like you say this, but are there any cases that disprove this or any cases where this isn't what's happening? And so really going through the iterative process of engaging with the data and sometimes returning to the source data and really trying to understand the story and what's going on. So again, this relies on familiarity with the data and engagement throughout. That traceability is really important. So you can refer back to the data and the source data and then reviewing everything that comes out and editing it, engaging with it, kind of holding your final thoughts in a separate document. So not taking everything that comes out of ChatGPT as like this is the final version, but really it's more of a like discussion partner or something to get the ideas flowing and to be able to access data quickly. Okay, so this is one example of what the final analytic product would look like. So this is, of course, shortened so that I can present it on a slide. But I'll show you just one of the kind of a segment of one theme from this study. So disruption did not determine engagement trajectory. Families experienced substantial instability, including seizures, hospitalizations, travel, caregiver stress, and competing demands. However, disruption alone did not distinguish families who sustained participation from those who disengaged. Some families maintained engagement despite repeated hospitalizations, seizure escalations, and major life events. Others experienced prolonged reductions in participation following comparatively fewer disruptions. What appeared to differentiate these trajectories was not the presence of disruption itself, but the family's ability to modify implementation, rebuild routines, and integrate strategies into changing circumstances. So this theme emerged across multiple framework constructs and also recognizes the range of participant summaries. So that's again using those column summaries and those row summaries in order to understand what's going on in the data. And some of the other themes that came out of this work were themes around the importance of reinforcing feedback loops. So that's where early successes in the intervention appear to strengthen the caregiver's confidence, their routine formation, and their perception of child progress. And that created momentum for continued participation. And we also identified some coachable adaptation skills. So, how do we promote this adaptation? That seems to be so important to the intervention engagement process. Um, and you can start to see through these examples how this type of analysis is really attempting to uncover the mechanisms and the process of implementation, both the successes and the challenges. Okay, so I know that was a lot of information about this method, and I'm happy to answer questions as they come at the end here. But I'll take kind of a step up to thinking about the big picture contributions of these methods, but also some of the risks. So as we discussed, one of the major risks of this method is that AI output can be plausible but incorrect. And I absolutely agree that that is a real and major risk. But I think it's also one that's carried by all researchers. So researchers across all disciplines, regardless of their use of AI, are responsible for ensuring the accuracy of their data and the trustworthiness of their results. So, a lot of that responsibility is held with the researcher to be able to you know, promote that these are the real results and that they've done the diligent work to ensure that all of that they're saying are results are real. But we can also add some design methods to make it clear exactly what the responsibility of the researcher is. And we can also support that rigor through methods checklists and peer review, which is absolutely needed for this method. And then on the flip side of that, I think that AI allowed us to apply this framework and the coding rules very consistently and transparently across thousands of observations. So sometimes AI is considered a black box, and I do understand that. But I actually find in this research that the level of tangible documentation and specificity that's needed to create a well-performing AI tool actually creates a substantial amount of transparency in the process. So another risk of this type of work is and this is something I've noticed in my own work, is the reduced opportunity for team discussion. So on the one hand, I had a very available research companion in ChatGPT, but that doesn't necessarily replace the need for alternative interpretations from real team members. So I think that knowing that a lot of this research was done independently really emphasized the need to, continue to reach out to people on the research team to review and discuss these results to get alternative perspectives. So really just finding and seeking those opportunities. The other side of that, though, is that this process made a multi-source analysis of clinical trial data much more feasible for myself as a dissertation level researcher, or for a small research team where there wasn't really um, a big research team available to get this type of analysis done. So in many ways, if you're comparing, can we do this analysis at all to will it ever get done? I think that this type of method allows for larger quantities of data to be included in analysis, and might kind of promote more frequent analysis of clinical trial data. Okay, and then I'll just summarize with four conditions that I think are potentially the most important for success in this method. And I've said them many times throughout this talk. But number one, deep familiarity with the data is so, so critical. It really is what leads that ability to identify when there are misinterpretations or errors in the data. A strong conceptual framework and codebook, so ensuring that you have a clear understanding of how you want this data to be sorted, that you really understand the framework that you're using, and that you have a strong codebook to be able to sort data appropriately. Ongoing human review, absolutely important. And then continuing to document your thoughts along the way as the researcher through memoing, and then also ensuring that data traceability so that you can always go back to the source data to confirm things that the AI tool is saying. Okay, and thinking forward to future directions. So the first step here is, and the next step here is publication. So this work really is ripe for peer review, to really ensure that the rigor of these methods, and hopefully that also leads to replication so that other folks can continue to use this method. Um, but if these approaches continue to perform well, I think that there's tremendous opportunity for expanding implementation analysis within clinical trials. So, as we said at the beginning, clinical trials collect a ton of rich longitudinal data. Oftentimes, those are never analyzed because of the extensive resources required that end up being prohibitive. Um, so there's a lot of opportunity there. And then we've also seen some rapidly growing tools. One that I want to highlight that I haven't used myself, but might be of interest, particularly to folks who are less comfortable with AI. There are some newly available open source CFIR tools. So tools that other researchers have made to kind of support many of the mechanisms of this process. Um, They're also constantly improving AI-assisted implementation workflows. So a lot of the qualitative data processing tools that we already know and love, things like Deduce or In Vivo, are starting to integrate some of this AI assistance into their workflows. So you may be able to bridge some of this work with existing tools. And then another kind of emerging tool that I'll highlight is just the rapidly evolving capabilities of LLMs. So I originally did this research back in the fall, and this, as I was kind of putting things together for this talk, reanalyzed some of the data and am, amazed at how much better it is now, even compared to 6 months ago. So, these tools are continuing to evolve and get better. So their ability to perform this research at a high level, is only improving. And with that, I would like to thank all the families who were so engaged throughout this research process and who remained motivated despite all of the challenges that they faced and who always inspire me with their love for their kids. And then I'd also like to thank all the members of the research team who made the study possible and particularly those who are helping to bring this research to publication. And finally, I'm very eager to engage with other researchers doing this type of work, so please do reach out if you'd like to connect.
That was awesome, um, Carly. I'm always amazed at this. It just, it's amazing. Um, so it sounds like you spent a lot of time up front, sort of training your agent. So how much time do you think you saved? I mean, you did all of this from start to finish in about how long?
Yeah, so I think, I was a little resistant to put like specific numbers on the screen because I was also developing this tool as we were going. So, what I presented here was kind of the straightforward, like how I think the best practice to do this is. But as I was doing it, I was iterating quite a bit more than this. I've done this now with other processes and tools. I think each project is a little bit different. Um, but I think, the initial analysis took me probably anywhere around like 4 weeks to do. So that included, several days of building the AI tool, several days of processing the data, and then, more time engaging with the analysis. So I think it's, overall a pretty quick process and one that continues to get faster.
Wow. Yeah, that sounds amazing. So if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A, although I see I have one here in the chat. I can read it to you. So thank you for this great talk. This is from Savannah. Very curious about AI use of qualitative data and appreciate all the emphasis on human review and knowledge of the data throughout the trust, transparency, validation. Would love to know about equity within these frameworks between your clients. You mentioned employment and other case
Mm.
aspects, use of new equity implementation science frameworks such as the I am for Equity
Hmm.
framework
Hmm.
and using tools like Atlas, TIAI, which are not yet approved by many institutions. So, thought?
Sure. Yeah, so I think to speak to the kind of equity questions within our study, I think there were absolutely a lot of challenges that emerged around kind of the density of disruptions for families. So families who had disruptions come up and then were able to recover, kind of were able to continue that trajectory of improving, of building routines. But for families who had just repeated instability, I think it was a lot harder for them to get engaged. So that kind of speaks to the equity question of it may just be harder to be engaged in intervention if your family has a lot of major instability going on. To speak to equity within frameworks, so this framework, and you mentioned another framework that's more equity focused. One of the great things about this analysis is that it could be used with any framework. Um, so if your research questions are more geared towards equity, then absolutely selecting a framework that's equity focused that can kind of help you structure how you're thinking about your data through an equity lens. And then you could do exactly the same process of data analysis, but with a more equity focused framework. So it's really transferable in that way.
Hmm. Um,
Oh,
yeah.
and then I think the last question on the Atlas TI tool. So yeah, I think that working within the restrictions of your institution is probably uh, important. It's definitely important. So, there are ongoing efforts to try, as a researcher, you can always try to encourage your institution to do review on new tools to be able to approve them. That can take some time. So, working within tools that are already approved and seeing if there are ways to embed AI throughout is another alternative.
Okay, another question. You developed the ChatGPT agent. How are you able to share the one you already build to other and ensure the output is consistent for the other researcher?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think it's definitely something to consider. I think that actually the process of building the tool was also really informative to me as the researcher to be able to continue to monitor it. So I don't know if somebody picked up this tool and tried to use it on their own project, if they would have the same level of rigor. So it's definitely something to consider whether tools like this can be transferable. But to me, I also think that there's value in the process of building the tool. Um, and I think that the consistency with other researchers, again, this tool was very much designed for this particular project. So I think researchers also need to design tools for their project. I think if you were to take this exact tool and repeat the analysis within this exact study, I think you would get very similar results. But if you were to do it with a different study, you probably would get different results. So I think its replicability might um, look different in this case, where you're not looking for the same results, but kind of the same robustness of methods, I think.
This is interesting. So, do you plan to compare the ChatGPT agent with a Claude agent? Because there's seems to be some evidence for Claude that's more robust regarding the analysis of multiple documents and extraction and analysis of data.
Yeah, so I think that there is, I get this question quite a bit, and I think again, you're to some extent restricted on what your institution allows. So UCLA allows ChatGPT and Gemini are the two tools that are approved. So in theory, you could do a comparison across the two. But again, there are certain tools on OpenAI that might not be available on Gemini. So I don't think, to my knowledge, that Gemini has the same kind of agent function, which was really critical for this research. Um, so I think, in a perfectly designed study with a institution that was facilitating this, I think you could do that type of research. But I think for now, it's not a direction that I'm headed. But I think that if there are institutions out there with multiple kind of equivalent tools, then I would love to see that research.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, so Abilene, you gave a message just to me, but I can't answer it. So like, is it okay if I read it? Um, I think it's uploading updated versions of the code book to the GP, the agent's knowledge
Mhm.
center. Did you experience or how would you handle model updates from OpenAI that might shift how the agent interprets rules mid-study? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really important consideration. And one thing I like about OpenAI as well is that you can select and within the kind of GPT agent, you can select what model you want it to use. So you can either have it use whatever the most updated model is, or you can lock it into like model 5.4 or something. So there are some ways to um, like ensure that kind of consistency across the model. And I think that can be helpful. And um, there was another part of that question too.
Um, Handling updates that
Yes,
might
handling
shift.
updates. Yeah, so one thing that I found was really important within the GPT, and I'm glad you brought this up because I do think that this is an important kind of learning, was that it was ensuring so when you update the code book into the GPT, you just update the GPT and it kind of updates the whole thing, so it should be consistent. But There was an aspect of ensuring that the GPT was able to read the code book. So it likes some versions of the code book better than others. In some cases, it likes it better in like an Excel spreadsheet version. In some cases, it likes it better in a PDF version. Um, so kind of depending on what model you're using or how you've laid out your instructions for the code book, the most important thing is to ensure that the GPT can actually read your code book. So for example, you might just ask, like, as soon as you start chatting, can you tell me all of the constructs in my code book? Just so you ensure that it's able to access it, you can kind of test it, like, what are the coding rules for this particular construct, and ensure that that it's able to give it back to you, just to make sure that it's reading the most updated code book. And that again is another advantage of the kind of AI, the GPT agent, because within just a regular chat, which does work to some extent for some of these types of methods, you can use a chat. But there's, I think, a little bit less reliability of like sticking to that one code book. And then if you update the code book, it now has multiple versions of the code book that it might be pulling from. So you just have a little bit more control within the GPT agent. But I think you can do this within just a regular chat as well.
So I can imagine that you would need to identify which version of ChatGPT you use, have your code book
Hmm.
in terms of replicability.
Hmm.
Or, I mean, I can't imagine someone trying to do a meta-analysis of these kinds of things because it's like a fast-moving train. Everything is
Hmm.
changing all the time. So that will be important. You also, I think, took a course, right? That there are courses, and maybe that would be of interest to folks.
Yeah. I took a really great course from a Qualitative Methods Institute. I think it was out of UNC. They offer a bunch of different qualitative methods, and they had a new one last year on qualitative analysis with AI. Um, so I think at that stage, it was a lot of just kind of like building comfort around and trustworthiness, like can AI actually do this? What is it better at doing than humans? So there's a lot of helpful information out there, and I'm happy to share that as well. I think you could probably find it on Google, but that was a great course, and they have a ton of great courses on other qualitative methods as well.
And Veronica says that she has a potential suggestion for how to
Mhm.
incorporate another research partner during the analysis process and reliability checks. So, Veronica, why don't you tell us?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I was thinking there's certain like checkpoints in your data. So like you go or through the analysis process where you go through, you train the model to see, okay, yes, is it doing like that's probably a natural point for another person to come in and say, okay, yes, I agree that this model is actually doing the same thing. And then so
Hmm.
you would have that reliability number of, okay, the AI produces reliability with whatever this amount is. But then there's also the agreement between you and the other
Hmm.
researcher of, okay, this is happening here. And that could be done at a few different stages throughout the analysis process. And then especially if it's the same person or same team of people, you have someone who's already familiar with your data. And so that way, when you're going through the development of themes process, you have people who you can bounce off other ideas with that are already kind of embedded in or enmeshed in the data.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And I think it also solves some of the challenges of, you know, I've also heard researchers ask, like, can you compare AI use to human
Hmm.
coding? Which, as one person doing the project, that becomes impossible because now I've already done the AI coding, so I can't really go back and do it by hand.
Yeah.
But to have two separate people coding, I think, does solve that. And you can also do like have a second coder review 10% of the data or
Hmm.
something, and
Yeah.
calculate like a Cohen's value or something to kind of compare their agreement. So I think that's a great idea.
Hmm. Yeah, and then I think you know just something that one of the things that you mentioned as a potential limitation was the like plausible solutions, but not actually the case.
Hmm.
I think just incorporating member checks with people in similar situations, I think helps to get around that the same way as it would with you know doing it the traditional way.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'll highlight too that both of those suggestions, just for folks who may be less embedded in qualitative research, both of those are kind of methods of rigor within the qualitative research domain. So again, like we're not fully reinventing the wheel here. We're figuring out how to embed AI functions into existing qualitative and implementation methods. So like you mentioned, kind of working within what we already have and pulling from other folks who have spent a lot of effort building rigor into these processes.
Okay, well, I think our time is up, and I just want to thank you, Carly. This was fascinating. I'm really excited about it and sort of what the future holds. I can't wait till we can use AI to actually code videos, observations. So let's
Yeah,
hope
hopefully that's around the
someone.
corner.
I hope so. I hope so. So thank you very much. And if anyone wants more information, you can go to the website. You can see this presentation again because we recorded it. And I'm sure Carly would be available for questions.